All right, so we want to go get this product produced, and this enters one of the most critical phases of building a physical products brand, which is finding the right factory partner. If you look at the critical path of building a physical products brand or an Amazon centric brand, there's a bunch of them. I think that obviously selecting the right product idea and concept goes a long way. Obviously, if you get that right, a lot of other things in the process are easier, from marketing to pay-per-click to finding success to getting cash flow. All those things kind of fall into step. I would say one of the critical path items is also finding the appropriate factory partner. If you find the right factory partner, it makes a lot of other things easier, from product development to logistics to cost savings to building a strategy in a long-term business that can stand the test of time. So the purpose of this video here is really to review the critical frameworks for sourcing and identifying the right factory partner. So in my physical products career, I've probably worked with somewhere around 20 to 25 factories. This is a photo of my first ever trip to China. I think this was about 5 years ago. Me on the left there, that's a double XL kind of outfit in one of the factories. And then you can kind of just see me with some of the engineers and then some of the folks at the factory there. So I spent a lot of time in China. I've been to a lot of factories. I've been up and down the country to numerous cities and regions. I've spent north of $100 million on products from China. I've probably shipped somewhere in the 6 to 800 container range. So this is a world that I'm fairly familiar with, and have kind of fused together some of the things that I've learned through my own actual experience, in addition to tapping into the knowledge of others that kind of source day to day for a living and bringing those best practices in together. So really, the good quality factories can save you a massive amount of time and money over the long term. This is definitely one of those things where you do not want to jump over dollars to get cents. Sometimes the lowest price is not always the lowest price when you look at it in concert, from mistakes to the strategic benefit of the product, to having a partner that can build a product that works, to having better terms. Look at this honestly like you're going to seriously date and potentially marry somebody. That's the kind of relationship you're getting into. Because once you launch a product, especially if you do customizations and molds and all those other things, you're really kind of in bed with them for 1+ year. It's really hard to turn back and find another factory for stuff when you've really ingrained your business with a particular partner. So on the flip side, bad factories can be incredibly detrimental to your business. It's really hard to unwind. It can cost you a lot of money. There's a lot of hidden costs. But more importantly than even costs is just the hidden stress and decision fatigue that a bad partner brings into the table. You're going to be up at night on WeChat chatting with factories, fixing problems. You're going to be, sending emails you don't want to send. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be thinking about things that aren't necessarily creating value for your business. You're going to be doing things to fix problems. So focusing on this process and really trying to identify the best possible factory for the product you're trying to build is one of the most critical things you can do throughout the process of building a physical products brand. So really there's 4 or 5 kind of key things that I like to think about. First, quality first, right? Especially when you're in the sourcing stage. This is not necessarily the time to nickel and dime on price, although price obviously matters to make the economics work. But it's really about quality product and quality suppliers first. You can work on price, you can work on negotiation, you can work on structures that are more amicable down the line. But if you don't have a quality product and you don't have a quality factory, all that stuff doesn't matter in the end anyway. So communication professionalism is one of the key things that I look at, especially earlier on. Again, you're going to be having a lot of late night conversations, especially if you're in the US or a Western country. You're going to be on WeChat, you're going to be sending emails. There's going to be some hyper stressful situations that will come up that you have to solve together, whether it be product situations or logistical challenges. So having somebody that you can communicate with, that you can lock arms with and really be in the trenches with is critically important with the factory partner. And then the other final thing is that we really want to try to orient ourselves so that we're working with the factory and not a trading partner. There are some situations where a sourcing agent makes sense, but even in those situations, I always want to have the capability to directly work with the factory that's actually producing the product. And we'll get into some of that here later on in the presentation. So what are the steps to finding a qualified supplier? We're going to go through an example actually over the shoulder on Alibaba here towards the end of this presentation so you can see this in practice. We'll try to source one of our golfing products here as an example. But basically you want to just have some very specific search criteria and filtering criteria using something like an Alibaba or one of these other online services where you can really whittle down the potential factories that could be in the hundreds down to ones that really meet the criteria that we are looking for a qualified factory. It's really a more formal RFQ process. It's professional. This is kind of our buyer's resume. When you're starting to interact with factories for the first time, they're assessing you as much as you're assessing them. So we want to really institutionalize some of these things here that really put our best foot forward as potential buyers so that they want to give us the best price, they want to work with us, and they want to kind of bend over backwards to bring us on as a long-term buying partner. You really want to set the tone during this process of trying to qualify suppliers too. Let them know how you operate, how professional you are, and vice versa, you can evaluate them as well. And again, worry about the price and the terms later. We'll get into that in some of the negotiation stuff later on so you can kind of see how we do that. The number one goal is to find the best factory. And again, critically important is the communication, especially in the early stages. So reverse engineering is another approach that you can use to find a factory. We're going to go into Alibaba from scratch and try to find some, but there are some hacks, so to speak, where you can look at import records if your competitors have not hidden their import records, and you can actually see who they've shipped products from. So one of the free tools that tends to be pretty good is Import Yeti. You can tend to find most competitors there. So you just want to kind of go onto your competitor's product on Amazon, click on who's selling it, and then you can actually get the legal entity information and the address and things like that typically. So you want to kind of use Import Yeti is a quick, cheap one. Panjiva is one that costs a little bit of money, but is very good, as is Import Genius. Import Genius was actually created by the same guy that started Flexport, which is kind of a large kind of startup technology-based freight forwarder now. And then Jungle Scout. I haven't used Jungle Scout much for anything on Amazon in a very long time, but they have a pretty cool little add-on within Jungle Scout where you can actually plug in an ASIN or copy in a link to a product on Amazon, and then they will try to reverse engineer some of those import records as well. So one other way that you can do this is just actually see who some of these alpha ASINs potentially are sourcing their products from. It doesn't work all the time, but you can tend to uncover those potential factories as well. One other kind of quick aside before we get into other stuff, if you don't want other people to see your products and where they're coming from and which factories they come from into the US, you can actually send an email to Vessel Manifest Confidentiality at cbp.dhf.gov, which is a government agency in the US, and you can actually have them hide your manifest records. So you can just request that. You need to provide, I think, a form, and you need to submit it with your LLC, kind of the different names that you may import under, and then they'll let you know, okay, yes, we have received your request and implemented that. So I definitely recommend that just so others can't reverse engineer your own factories, because sometimes it's a lot of work to find the right ones. So moving along, factory versus trading company. A big goal with this initial wave of sourcing is really just to interact with the factory directly. We want to filter out trading companies, and we want to use some strategies to uncover who those trading companies are. If you ask most people on Alibaba, are you a trading company? Everybody's going to say no, especially the trading companies, because they know that typically we don't want to be dealing with the middleman. We want to be dealing directly with the factory. So there's some strategies we'll get into to avoid working with trading companies. Even if you're using a sourcing agent, oftentimes sourcing agents, because they get an ongoing percentage typically with ongoing orders, they don't want you to know who the actual factory is. If you even use a sourcing agent, I'm always very upfront and saying, hey, I have no issues paying you if we come to an agreement on what that kind of arrangement is, and you're going to help on an ongoing basis with this product and with this factory. But I want to know exactly who the factory is. I want to have direct line of communication with them. And when I come to China, I expect to visit them. So you really want to kind of make sure that you're able to have a direct relationship. And why that's important is that when shit hits the fan, and it will hit the fan from time to time, you need to make sure that you have the capability of interacting directly with the folks that matter and not through a middleman with different intentions. So again, like having the right offer of product, the right factory makes everything else easier. And we need to be mindful of that throughout this entire process. Even when we're tired and we kind of want to just pull the trigger, it's super important to find the right partner. So a couple things that we're going to look at when we get into Alibaba and really any sourcing method. One important distinction that you can kind of note when you're looking at companies for the first time and trying to source the right factory is that there's a very prescribed way to name a company in China. So obviously in the US or Canada, Australia, Europe, most of these countries, you can just kind of name it whatever you want to name it. There's a very prescribed way in China that basically goes with location, the name of the company, typically the main product line or industry, and then the partnership type. So if you ever go to a trade show like the Canton Fair or CES in the US or some of these trade shows where there's a lot of Asian-based suppliers, you'll go to some like rows and it's like Shenzhen this, Shenzhen that, Dongguan this, Dongguan. Like, it's like, what the heck? Why is everybody naming their stuff after cities? It's because that's how you have to file an entity within China. So here's an example down below of how the structure would look like. Let's say I was a Shenzhen-based company. It would be Shenzhen Heist Products Golf Equipment Co. Limited. So that's the prescribed format. So we can use this information to help uncover if we're actually dealing with a factory, number one, and if we're actually dealing with a company aligned with the type of product we want to make. Or are they kind of a one-stop shop and they do a bunch of different stuff that's not really oriented to the kind of product expert that we want to have making our product. And then there's the business type, again, manufacturing versus trading, but they can be both. All trading kind of indicates is that somebody has an export license. So the difference is that if it's manufacturing and trading, that basically means that they're a factory, but they also have a license to export it out of China. If they are just a trading company, that basically means that they're working with factories that don't have export licenses, and all they're doing is a middleman kind of role. Usually they speak really good English too, and they can kind of represent communicating with foreign sellers, but their sole purpose is just to help export the product. So we want typically manufacturing only, or even better, a manufacturing, trading company is kind of the nomenclature on Alibaba. And again, we'll get into that. Typically, unless it's a kind of a truly innovative product, unless I've visited the factory in person. Sometimes there's also factories that like spin off, like you might have a leader in a factory and then they spin off to go start their own factory, and they're young and have been around for less than 3 years. In some circumstances, I'll work with factories that are younger than this, but typically you want to be 3+ years in business. It just shows that there's some longevity. They know what they're doing. They know how to operate, etc. And then the final thing that you can kind of note in the who are they kind of spec is just what kind of certifications they have. These are oftentimes nice to have, but there's definitely some categories where it is a need to have scenario. But one indication, if they're like ISO 9000 and they've got some of these other ISO certs and CE certs and FDA certs and all these things, it just shows that they're more legitimate and that they actually are a factory when they've got these certifications. And you can actually check to make sure that it is their actual certification too, just to make sure that they're not fraudulently showing paperwork for certs that they don't have. The next layer of this is really just what do they make? Again, some of that comes from the name, just based on kind of the product name. But the cool thing about China is it's very regionalized. So the Chinese government in the 90s really started to expand economic zones. And so they wanted to really cultivate the country such that they could kind of use the labor from the kind of rural farmer areas and kind of cultivate these regions that would help develop the country and develop jobs. And a lot of those regions are very specific to different product types. So like electronics are very popular in Shenzhen as an example. As you go farther north, you get more into textiles like fabrics, blankets, leathers, things like that. So there's very interesting regional pockets that tend to circulate around the raw materials that a particular vertical is used to make, and then those are the factories that kind of stem out of that. So most cities will make the same goods. So it's definitely a warning sign if, say, you're kind of looking at your factory list, you found 15 factories and like one you really like, but it's in a totally different city. It's potentially a high risk thing that they're a trading company if they're just in a weird city. It's just another flag that you can look at to see if it makes sense for why they are in a different city than the other ones. You can also look at the product concentration too to see what kind of products they make. So again, if somebody's making, say, a golf bag, if I go into their catalog and I see golf bag, golf clubs, golf balls, whatever, that's actually probably a concern, honestly. I want to see somebody who's making luggage, who's making golf bags, who's making carry-on bags, like somebody that is an expert in making bags. That should be my focus, because you want to have somebody that has repetitive processes. They've got good machinery. They've got a staff that does very repetitive tasks, and their quality is typically going to be a lot better. In addition to that, they've got more focus, more experience, but they also have better buying power because they're buying a lot of the same raw materials. They've got those economies of scale that can then be carried on to you in terms of better pricing. So you typically want to have somebody that's a more concentrated expert in the product category that you're looking to make versus spread out doing a bunch of different things. And again, what do they make? You can again look at product starts here. Some of these may be required depending on the category that you're in. So some of them are very generic, like that ISO stuff I kind of mentioned earlier. But some of it's UL, ROS, CE, FDA, and then MSDS sheets are specific to certain products. So you just want to make sure that if you're category requires some specific certs, or you would like to, for your particular product category, have certs, that you can actually make sure that you scrub those and ensure that the factories have the ones that matter. Moving on, where are they? Again, a good trading company check that I like to use, in addition to kind of the company name, can sometimes reveal stuff if just they're in a really weird category or a generic category. That could be one red flag. But another one is really just the address, which you can see in Alibaba. So they're forced to show if they're just a trading company, number one. But if you're kind of not sure if they're solely a trading company or if they're really the factory, oftentimes you can look at the address, right? And if it's an office building address, like on the 11th floor in a city center versus a rural kind of industrial area, that could be a red flag. Most factories that I've been to are like a maximum of like 4 or 5 floors. So if you see anything above that, it's definitely a red flag that there's somebody that's just operating out of an office building as a trading company. Obviously, they'll also be typically in a factory industrial area, which is like an hour plus outside of most of the major cities versus an office area. Anytime you go to visit a factory, it's a minimum of like a 40-minute drive and or train or bus, but it's typically an hour plus because they typically keep the factories outside of the city center. So the other thing I should say too is they can have a separate office where they've got like an office team or a marketing team or sales team that works in an office, and then the factory's separate. So that can happen even for a factory. But if you do see anything with an office-like address, you definitely want to do a secondary validation and probably have somebody go check to make sure that it's the actual factory and not a trading company. The other thing I would do too is a geographic check. So roughly 80% of the factories are very close to 5 coastal cities and ports, and that's just a really kind of efficient way for them to structure logistics and kind of shipping to get stuff to the port and then obviously out of the port. So the 5 main kind of coastal city zones are Guangdong, which has Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Zhongshuan; Zhejiang, which is Huawu, Ningbo, Hangzhou, Wenzhou, and Taizhou. And then there's Jiangsu or Shanghai area, Fujian, and Shandong. So if you see a particular factory and or factory/trading company and you're looking at the city and they're not in one of those zones, a couple things to kind of note there. I think the biggest one is just that they're more inland, right? So if you ever want to go visit them, it's going to be a total pain in the ass, and you're going to waste like probably a day or plus just going to visit the factory, which kind of sucks if you're doing a quicker trip to China. But more importantly than that, there's just some hidden costs, right? So you might have, better costs, but then all of a sudden consolidation's different because you've got these logistical hurdles. You've got to put it on a truck in the ground in China to get it to port, and it's sloppier and costly in terms of logistics. Oftentimes these more inland places too don't have the best kind of talent pools for employees. It's typically more rural folks, and they're just not in the city center, etc. So you tend to like not have as much sophistication from a manufacturing standpoint. So some red flags too, just to be kind of get in front of them. So if you see any of those things that you kind of get the vibe that it's a trading company and there's just some stuff going on, a couple ways to kind of get in front of it. One is to do a surprise visit. One thing I like to do is if you're on kind of WeChat, which we'll get into later on a little bit in terms of how you can leverage WeChat, but you can basically just do a bit of a surprise visit. Be like, hey, my agent or my employee, or you can use whatever name you want, is right in the area. They're just coming through Shenzhen. I want them to come by this afternoon. Can you make sure that you have a team available just to show them the factory? If they give you a bunch of excuses on that, it probably means that they're a trading agent. They have to then go try to find the factory to make sure that they can get there in time to go see and like chaperone the process. Man, I've seen all kinds of stuff. I've been in China where there was like somebody pretending to be the company, but they weren't, and they like had the front desk person like pretend it was. Anyway, there's some weird stuff that happens. Another thing that you can do too is just to say, hey, I want to do a video call of you at the factory. If they give you the runaround on that, again, it's a pretty good indicator that there's something might be going on. And then the other thing that you can do too is if you kind of start to see these red flags and they start to stack up and you kind of feel like you've got a trading company on your hands or something's not quite right, you can negotiate with the sourcing agent, and we'll leave some contacts in the course materials, just to do a one-time contract. So most of these sourcing agents basically do a deal where you pay them and then they're like on a 5% recurring or 7% recurring basis. They take that cut for every single PO you place in perpetuity if they source the factory for you. What I'll do in these situations, if I've sourced the factory and I kind of think that something might be going on, is you can ping a sourcing agent and just say, hey, look, I'm going to pay you a one-time thing. I actually just want you to confirm if this is actually the factory. I'll give you $500 or I'll give you $200 or whatever it is. So I don't want to pay you on an ongoing basis because I think I found the factory, but I just need you to validate who it is. The other thing you can do is the same folks that do product inspections, which we'll get into some of that later on, will typically do factory inspections as well. So you can put a request in to have them go in there and they can denote some of the paperwork and entity information to see who it is that actually is owning that particular factory. And again, if you see excuses, it's a major issue. You just got to be aware, trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, you got to do some additional due diligence to make sure you're working with the factory. So this is the general process. We basically go on to Alibaba or your sourcing platform of choice. We use very filtered criteria, which we'll get into to help kind of hone in on the higher quality factories and really getting to deal with only the factories, not the trading companies. We'll assess some red flags and make sure that we toss out the ones that we think are concerning. We'll do basically a bulk RFQ process, which saves a whack load of time. And I'll get into a template that I use that can really help deliver a really professional message in that first communication. Because the last thing that we want to do during the supplier kind of RFQ process is to make it seem like we're an Amazon seller. If somebody thinks that you're an Amazon seller, they think they've got a sucker on their hands, honestly. So they can tend to give you much different pricing and treatment if they think that you're an Amazon seller. They just don't think that it's as professional. So we've got a way to kind of represent ourselves in a much more professional light and avoid that situation. So we go from that list, we do the professional RFQ. Our big focus during this initial wave of communications is literally communication. So are they actually responding in a timely manner? Do they actually reply to the questions? And do they have an attention to detail? And then are they really kind of providing answers that we want to see to those questions? So that's kind of the first wave. And then also just realize it's not just you vetting them. This is a dual qualification process. You're vetting them, but they're also vetting you. They want to make sure that you're a high quality buyer, that you're going to be reliable, that you can scale, and they will give you much better treatment, pricing, and structure if they realize that you're a legit operator. And then the final wave is just negotiation, which is focusing on the product development side and getting that kind of negotiated, samples, terms, setting the stage for a long-term partnership, I think is super important. Part of that for me is just planting seeds for additional terms and structure after the initial order. So I'll give you an example. I love to get like 60-day net terms. Almost nobody's going to give you that out the gate. In fact, I've just never seen it in my experience dealing with China. So what you typically have to do is for like 6+ months, maybe even 12 months, like show you're a consistent, reliable buyer, that you place regular orders, that then you have leverage. But I like to plant that seed early on. Like, let's say I'm dealing with an account manager. I'll be like, look, I'll ask for terms right off the bat. They're going to say no. I'll say, okay, well, I just want your commitment that if I'm able to order X number of units over the next 6 months, and I'm going to give you consistent orders, that we're going to be able to have this conversation and you're going to be able to go to bat and get this for me in the future. Like, plant all those seeds very early on, because I think it sets the stage for those requests and those needs that you want to have happen as you scale and get more mature with the volume with a particular factory. And then some alternative options to Alibaba. There's 1688, which is a much more, I would say, Asian-centric kind of platform. A lot of the factories that don't have export licenses, as an example, or don't speak English, will operate on 1688. So if you're so inclined and want to use Google Translate and know how to kind of use WeChat to interact and do translations and stuff, you can absolutely use 1688. Sometimes there tends to be better pricing there. I think for most of us, Alibaba honestly is a pretty good setup for most, but 1688 is good, especially if you're doing like smaller add-ons that are super inexpensive. I'll tend to use 1688 for those. If you want to do US-based sourcing, there's a lot less flexibility with customization, and while you save, a lot of logistical headaches and things like that, the pricing and just the headache of dealing with stateside employers, but Wholesale Central is a good resource for that. And then another good one, honestly, is just old school trade shows. So whether, in a non-pandemic era, you want to go to China to the Canton Fair, that's usually a really good place to find category-specific factories all in one spot. And you can also meet your existing factories when you go there too. So it's kind of a good centralized meeting point. Definitely recommend that if you can pull it off. But the other thing is too, is you want to also look at your industry vertical and kind of your customer archetype centric vertical for wherever you live, and look at trade shows in that market. So, if I'm starting a golf brand, I might go to trade fair dates as an example and just search for any trade shows that are in the golfing vertical. You do not want to go to any trade shows that are consumer centric, right? That are like where customers go to buy. You want to go to more B2B wholesaler type shows, and you can tend to find domestic suppliers, especially at those shows in the country you're in, but you'll also have a lot of folks from Asia for the big ones that will fly out to those shows. And it's, again, another way to get additional ideas and to kind of see who's who in the zoo when it comes to sourcing. And then the final point I'll just say is that you're going to need WeChat. These initial waves of RFQs and back and forth communications will tend to happen on Alibaba, but I like to move it over to WeChat, so to speak, when things are getting a little bit more serious. Again, it sounds like we're dating when we're finding suppliers, and it kind of is like that. But WeChat is really just the hub of how you're going to communicate with any of your vendors in Asia. So you want your team to be on this if you've got it. You definitely want to be on it. And your mornings and your evenings are going to be spent interacting with suppliers, especially during product development phases, but definitely in the follow-up when you're getting orders shipped and you're kind of dealing with one-off issues or new tweaks you're making to products. All that communication is typically going to happen on WeChat. It's way more efficient than email, way more efficient than email, and highly recommend it. And it's kind of the hub of how folks in China communicate. It's kind of their Facebook, Gmail, text messaging, and mobile banking all in one. So it's kind of the be-all, end-all app. If you don't have WeChat, you will need to get somebody that actually grants you access to WeChat. And so I would definitely recommend doing that. And I think there's a limit on how many you can approve per year. So I personally have had given away too many of these. But if you don't have one, just find somebody in the course that you've been friendly with. Maybe just shoot them a DM and say, hey, do you mind validating my WeChat account? If you don't know anybody, feel free to do a post in the Facebook group, and hopefully somebody will be able to sort you out. The one thing though is to get somebody to approve your QR code and kind of validate your account. They need to do it like in a couple minutes. So you kind of got to get somebody that's like actively online at that time to be able to do it. But once you get WeChat set up, it's a lifesaver and a key part of managing vendors in China. Okay, so the next video, we're going to actually go into this in practice and show what this looks like in an actual Alibaba live over the shoulder example. And we'll try to source some of our golf products so you can see how this stuff works.